When discussing Japanese martial arts, the term Bushido is often mentioned with nearly dogmatic reverence. The famous way of the warrior. But what if I told you that the path we all know today is actually quite far from what it really was? And it's nothing more than the idealization of a man who wanted to make his country look good. Would you believe me? Today we're going to start a series where we'll be exploring some concepts, stories, and lies, as well as misunderstandings about martial arts. As the master and lord of the Licubers, I've decided to begin with this subject. And just a heads up, I know that more than one purist is going to think that talking about this is throwing shade at the foundations of many martial arts and other things. As my followers know, I'm not a fan of martial arts, but the information is available for those interested. And if you want to stick with your version, that's great, but if you want to add to your knowledge and reevaluate what you know, even better. In simple terms, Bushido is a code of conduct that was supposed to govern the lives of samurai in ancient Japan. And it was based on 7 virtues: justice, courage, benevolence, courtesy, sincerity, honor, and loyalty. Nowadays, some authors and scholars add an 8th, which would be self-control, but essentially there are 7. That's it. Technically, one of the first mentions of Bushido, or the oldest known record, comes from a writing called Hoyogunkan from 1616, which is a military chronicle. The manual mentions Bushido approximately 30 times across its 20 volumes. And in some passages, it criticizes the use of individuals skilled in Bushido for administrative matters, showing that Bushido was related to the dynamics of war. But the fact that the word existed in the 1600s and was associated with war doesn't make it so. Something universal for Japan at the time it was written. Before that, there were already similar texts or concepts like the Kyuba no Michi or the Way of the Bow and Horse, which dates back to the Middle Ages and was widely developed during the Kamakura period. Each clan had a unique, loosely defined code of conduct that outlined expectations for its members. You didn't necessarily have to follow it to the letter, and most of them had Confucian or Zen Buddhist elements. So what's the problem with Bushido? The thing is, what we know and associate with it is the result of Inazo Nitobe's interpretation. Inazo was basically an example of those cases where you can be good at something, but there will always be an Asian who does it better than you. He hailed from a samurai family, was educated in Japan and the United States, and worked as a teacher, writer, agricultural economist, and diplomat. The Virgin.
I have a bag here full of books, and another bag here which is my gym bag.
So you can see that my life isn't easy?
Nitobe apparently was in Germany when a distinguished scholar, Professor Leivlai, asked him if there was religious education in the schools. When he was met with a resounding no as an answer, he replied, "If there isn't a solid religion to teach them values, how do you provide moral education?" This question sparked something in Inazo, who realized that in the West, people were unaware of how things worked in the emerging Japanese power. And so he got to work and began writing a book that would become known as Bushido, The Soul of Japan, which was published in English between 1899 and 1900. The date changes depending on the sources. With this book, what he wanted was to explain to Westerners how morality and ethics were handled in Japan. And to make it easier to digest for Europeans, above all, he looked for common starting points. While in Europe they had the customs of chivalry, in Japan the samurai had an equivalent. Apart from that, he also used some elements from doctrines like Buddhism, some Confucianism, and Shintoism to shape the book.
That's a great trick, huh?
One of the main issues with this text comes from the author's interpretation. Well, he took it upon himself to break down those customs and practices that were part of a samurai's life, let's say the original Bushido, and he created a sort of light Bushido where he suggested that those samurai values and ethics permeated Japanese society. But he also made it clear that not everyone could live by it. Coincidence? I don't think so. But Nitobe left out things from the samurai world that really make you think. In the book, seppuku, the ritual samurai suicide, is portrayed in an extremely romanticized manner as an honorable act that every samurai sought if they lost their honor. However, most samurai actually preferred to switch masters, contrary to popular belief. And those who didn't change masters didn't automatically go and commit seppuku either. Most of the time, seppuku was a sentence imposed on samurai, and even when condemned to do it, they often didn't actually cut open their belly, a crucial part of the ritual symbolizing the courage to face suffering. Instead, they would pretend with a blunt or wooden dagger, fake it, and then the katana strike would come down on them. Because at that point, they were going to die anyway, so why suffer by cutting open their own guts? This aspect, which has been so idealized, has been refuted by authors like Andoryu Rankin in his book Seppuku, A History of Samurai Suicide. As with the given example, there are many other similar cases. The real issue lies in the significant impact of the book mentioned earlier. First, it came out at a time when Japan was eagerly seeking its own identity, in the midst of growing modernization. During the famous Meiji period, when Japan transitioned from a feudal country to a modern power, the shogunate was abolished, imperial power was restored, the country industrialized, a modern army was created, and doors opened to Western trade and technology. It was a total revolution, and the book was perfect for the empire. It talked about the virtues of the Japanese people, about how Japanese society was and how it should be, and most importantly, it made it clear that the Japanese people were loyal to the emperor. That's why the text was quickly translated into Japanese in 1908 and became rooted in society, driven in a way by the empire. The Meiji Restoration overthrew the shogunate, so anything that legitimized or strengthened its image was very well received. And here's where another problem comes in. Because the rise of the book promoted historical overlap and the belief that Bushido was something practiced by all of Japanese society, when that's not true either. Authors like Carl F. Friday criticized exactly that Nitobe's Bushido is a modern construct and that, as such, there was no unified code called Bushido before the Meiji era until Nitobe wrote the book. That rather than being a truthful piece of history, or actually speaking about the values and ethics of pre-Meiji Japan, it was only trying to give easy answers to Westerners. And to do so in terms they could understand, he had to create a story that served his purpose. And in doing so, he omitted very important aspects. Freud says, and I quote Nitobe, was very westernized. The definition of Bushido and its 7 virtues is partially true and partially false. Let me explain. That is, historically, Bushido, as it is known, is a lie as big as a zeppelin that could have appeared in 1616. Despite Nitobe's claims in his book, his description of Bushido is not universally practiced in Japan to the extent he portrays. But with its appearance, the definition was born. And, for example, authors who support the concept say that, well, it's something that has evolved over time and so on. Those who claim it evolved are reluctant to acknowledge the atrocities committed by Japan during the war. But Japanese, where they committed massive atrocities, like the Nanking Massacre, where more than 200,000 civilians died, where there were mass rapes, and where there was extreme brutality. Or the kamikaze who crashed their planes loaded with explosives, trying to cause as much damage and destruction as possible. And those are also examples of Bushido. They say that's a distortion promoted by the empire, which it is. Careful. But if you tell me that the concept evolves, I can't skip a face just because it doesn't align with what they defend. While the 7 virtues were ideals, some samurai embodied a few or even all of these virtues, as with anything in the world. But they were the exception. Besides, the 7 virtues as such come from those common points that Nitobe wanted to equate with the European chivalric code. That is, he made up the order and assigned virtues at will with which people in the West could identify. That's called strategy. And this is where the question comes in that probably many of you who practice Japanese martial arts are asking yourselves, is what I've been taught about Bushido in my style or martial art a lie? Technically, yes, you're not walking any warrior's path, nor are you keeping any combat traditions alive. Even more so considering that nowadays many Japanese styles have been neutered for the sake of sport. Pre-Meiji era. There were the Koryu Bujutsu, or traditional martial arts, and when the restoration came, some martial arts were born and others were reformed. And that's how the Gendai Budo, or modern martial arts, appeared. They left aside the warlike aspects of martial arts and became teaching systems for self-defense with a strong moral and ethical development. Because besides defensive techniques, discipline, respect, and, well, all the things that as martial artists you would know were taught. Basically, if your style is Japanese and has do in its name, like karate, do judo, aikido, it is influenced by Nitobe's Bushido. I wasn't expecting that. Why? Simple. Because this book was key in shaping the Japanese identity for the future that was coming their way. It gave them, so to speak, an ethical and moral compass with which they would venture into a period of change in which the martial arts, just like the nation, had to be reformed. The Bushido you know is largely a lie, one that ended up influencing Japanese martial arts. And you may not be following the true path of the warrior, But if you have learned discipline, respect, self-control, if you have learned to defend yourself or others, and you are in good shape. So, if all this is making you a better person, even if you're not following the original Bushido, honestly, who cares?